Chapter 1. The last train to St. Mary Mead was an unusually crisp spring evening in St. Mary Mead, the kind of evening that made even the hedgerows look freshly combed, and the lamplit cottages seemed to breathe in unison. The 6:10 from Paddington was running 5 minutes late, which in a village such as this amounted to something nearly scandalous. Miss Jane Marple recently returned from a short stay in London, where she had visited a second cousin recovering from a minor operation and taken tea with the widow of an old schoolmate, had settled herself on her rose-patterned chintz armchair near the window of her front parlour. She noted the train's delay with the kind of detached curiosity she applied to everything, from weather patterns to whispers about engagements. By habit, she glanced toward the station, just visible through the hedgerows. The train chugged in, at last, exhaling a ribbon of steam that caught the last of the golden light. She could see the vague shapes of alighting passengers, mostly commuters or weekenders from London, but there was one figure that caught her attention. A woman, tall and striking in a dove-grey coat, stood motionless on the platform. She did not seem to be meeting anyone, nor did she hurry toward the village like the others. She simply stood as the train pulled away behind her, leaving the platform curiously quiet in its absence. Miss Marple blinked once, then returned to her knitting. A new pattern? Lacework this time, trickier than expected. The figure at the station had reminded her faintly of someone, but who? The answer would come far sooner than she expected. The following morning, St. Mary Mead was abuzz. Mrs. Biddle, who ran the post office and always claimed to know news before it was news, had declared to a small circle of shoppers that something, strange and altogether unpleasant, had happened during the night. This pronouncement, delivered in a dramatic whisper as she weighed a parcel of chutney jars, was more effective than any headline. Found her, they did, just by the crossing, face down in the ditch. Dead as anything, Mrs. Biddle said with a strange mix of reverence and relish. Who? Asked young Emily Price, breathless with anticipation. No one local. Stranger. Came in on the train, they think. Still had her ticket tucked in her coat pocket. By lunchtime, the whole village had heard. A woman, unfamiliar, elegant, possibly from London, had been found dead just outside the station gates. The constable, young Tommy Pike, had cordoned off the area and called for the county inspector, but no one quite knew what to make of it. Not a scratch on her, said Mr. Tulliver, the retired milkman, in hushed tones at the Blue Boar. But her eyes, they say they were wide open, like she'd seen something terrible. Some said poison. Others whispered of secret affairs and unmarked cars seen leaving the station lane. And while speculation thickened like fog over a marsh, Miss Marple quietly took her breakfast of boiled egg and soldiers, listening to the wireless while feeding her canary, Wren. She made no immediate remark on the matter, but she did lay aside her knitting for a full hour that afternoon. A rare occurrence indeed. It was Inspector Cray who arrived from Much Benham shortly after 3 o'clock. A square-jawed man with eyes like wet gravel, he had a reputation for handling rural deaths with an efficient, if unimaginative, hand. He examined the body, consulted the train logs, and held a brief meeting with the station master. Name's Margaret Calthorpe, he told the villagers later. Address in Kensington, ticket found on her, arrived last night on the 6:10. How did she die? Asked Mrs. Biddle, managing to look both scandalized and pleased at once. "We're not saying," Cray replied. "Not yet." This, naturally, only added fuel to the fire. But for Miss Marple, the name sparked a flicker of recognition. Margaret Calthorpe. Yes, she had read that name once in the Times, some years ago now, a small piece, a society column, something about a niece of a baronet's widow. A quiet scandal, perhaps, but no more than a whisper of it. And now the woman had died just beyond Miss Marple's garden fence, that evening, as the constable paced, the station path and the lights of the village dimmed one by one. Miss Marple sat in her parlour once again. Her knitting sat untouched on the table beside her, and Wren dozed peacefully in his cage. She held a single scrap of paper in her lap, page she'd torn from an old gardening magazine months before, intending to line the bottom of a pot. On it, in small print, was a notice of an engagement long cancelled, and beneath it the name of a certain Margaret Calthorpe, once of Sussex, recently returned from South Africa. A woman no longer at home, Miss Marple murmured to herself. And yet, why choose to come here? And why the last train? She reached for her telephone, turned the dial slowly, and when the line picked up, said, "Dolly dear, I know it's late, but have you a copy of Debrett's Peerage still about? I've a rather peculiar curiosity regarding the family of one Sir Anthony Welbury." Because Miss Marple knew something the others did not. A person does not take the last train into a village unless they are running from something, or toward it, and often that is how murder begins. Chapter 2. Rumours and Reputations. By midday the next morning, St. Mary Mead had entered a state of dignified frenzy. It was not the kind of frenzy that involved shouting or chasing or any form of vulgar display. No, the frenzy here was of the teapot and porch-leaning variety, the sort that settled behind lace curtains and echoed in hushed tones over ginger scones. Every respectable household had something to say about the dead woman from the station, and none were content with not being first to say it. "She had the look of a widow," murmured Mrs. Price at the greengrocer's. "But then again, you never can tell with London women." "A governess, more like," replied Mr. Sims, who had taken it upon himself to stand outside the post office for most of the morning, offering theories to anyone who would listen. "Quiet, proper. That kind always seems to have secrets. Or lovers." "I heard she asked about the vicarage before she died," said one of the Finchley twins. Nobody remembered which one. With an air of scandalized certainty, asked if they still kept lodgers. "I heard she never got as far as the vicarage," said young Freddie Ellis, who had started spending far more time near the station than his school attendance warranted. "None of you know a thing," declared Mrs. Biddle, flanked by 2 envelopes and an air of authority. "My sister's neighbour works for Dr. Castle, and he says the post-mortem revealed no injury, no bruise, no poison they can detect." "Then how did she die?" asked Mrs. Featherstone from behind the lettuce bin. Mrs. Biddle leaned in, lowering her voice. She was frightened. "To death, they think." A collective gasp followed. Over on the west side of the village at the old vicarage, the conversation was considerably quieter, but no less curious. Reverend Clemency, a gentle, thoughtful man with a fondness for crosswords and tweed slippers, sat with his wife Margaret over breakfast. The vicar's morning toast remained untouched. "Do we know if she meant to come here?" he asked, stirring his tea without much enthusiasm. "This Margaret Calthorpe? You said she asked for the vicarage?" "That's what Dora saw, yes. Apparently she was speaking to the porter, asked if the vicarage was still in use, but she didn't say why, and Dora, of course, couldn't help following her." Margaret Clemency set her cup down and frowned. She turned up the path toward the church, then vanished. The vicar sighed. "It's all very unpleasant. I do hope it wasn't some kind of confession." His wife gave him a sharp glance. "Seth, it was, Arthur. Then it's too late to worry about absolving anyone now." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had chosen to walk to the library. She claimed to need a new copy of Cranford, though the spine of her own was barely cracked. What she truly needed was movement, an opportunity to pass through the lanes and paths of St. Mary Mead, to be seen, to be overlooked, and to listen. Because Miss Marple understood that in villages, gossip moved like ivy, clinging, creeping, quietly reshaping old walls. And sometimes it was what wasn't said that mattered most. At the library, she found Colonel Easterbrook seated in the local history section, buried in a copy of England's glorious battles. He looked up as she entered and gave a respectful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "come to read about wars or women?" She smiled. "Whichever is currently wreaking more havoc, Colonel." He chuckled and set down his book. "Dreadful business, this murder, or whatever it was. Poor woman, all alone." "You believe she was murdered?" Miss Marple asked lightly, selecting a book from the shelf beside him. "Well, what else could it be?" He lowered his voice. "My dear wife has a theory. Thinks it's suicide, brought on by heartbreak. Apparently, she had the look of someone romantic. You know the type. Gaunt, dignified, tragic." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "I've found that people who die dramatically are very rarely the ones who've lived dramatic lives. It's the quiet ones you must worry about." Colonel Easterbrook laughed. "I dare say you're right," but Miss Marple's tone, beneath its lightness, had shifted slightly, because there was something quietly dramatic about a woman stepping off the last train into a sleepy village, asking for the vicarage, and dying in the dark. By late afternoon, Inspector Cray had made a second appearance. This time, he did not go straight to the scene of the body, but instead stopped at the Bayleaf guest house, where Miss Calthorpe's overnight bag had been delivered by mistake. The landlady, Mrs. Penelope Harcourt, had been most distraught by the idea that a body was linked, however indirectly, with her guest registry. "She never arrived," Mrs. Harcourt insisted. "Room 6 was all ready, fresh linen and everything. We even put out the shortbread, but she didn't come." The inspector nodded, and no one asked for her, or tried to claim the room. Not a soul. Cray examined the guest book. It was neat, in spidery ink, 5 entries, none of them Margaret Calthorpe. Back at home, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and reread the small notice she'd found in the Times. A 3-year-old piece, barely a whisper of information, but it included 2 things she found increasingly relevant. Margaret Calthorpe had once been engaged to a man named Benedict Welbury, the youngest son of Sir Anthony Welbury, and that engagement had been broken, suddenly and without reason, 2 weeks before the wedding. Miss Marple had remembered the case only vaguely. There had been hints of something improper, a business entanglement, a relocation, but then it had vanished from society's memory, until now. Now Margaret Calthorpe was dead, and someone had wanted her to die quietly, without disruption. But Miss Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know nothing stayed quiet for long. Chapter 3. The Quiet Listener. The day after the body was found, Inspector Cray convened his first round of proper interviews in a makeshift office in the back room of the village hall. The room was chilly, its sole window perpetually fogged, and the single electric heater buzzed with a soft whine like an indignant wasp. Cray, bundled in his overcoat and mildly annoyed at the lack of progress, had begun to develop an early distaste for St. Mary Mead. It was, in his estimation, a village altogether too tidy, like a house where the floors had been swept too clean, too often, in an attempt to hide what had once stained them. The official cause of death, from the coroner's early notes, was listed as acute cardiac arrest of indeterminate origin. No bruising, no visible injury, no foreign substance in the bloodstream. The woman had collapsed and died within minutes of leaving the station, and yet nothing in her body betrayed why. Which, of course, made it all the more suspicious, especially because the train ticket in her coat pocket had been neatly folded. Far too neatly for someone in distress. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had spent the morning arranging tulips. This activity, wholly unrelated to the murder, and yet profoundly meditative, gave her the opportunity to process what she had learned. She had not attended the formal interviews, of course. No, invitation had been issued. But she had, quite by accident, run into young Tommy Pike, the village constable, outside the baker's shop. "My aunt's got high blood pressure," Tommy said, in response to Miss Marple's entirely innocuous remark about the weather. "Funny thing is, the doctor says it's stress, but she hasn't left the house in 3 weeks. Just listens to the wireless and knits those ghastly shawls." "I've often thought," Miss Marple replied, adjusting her scarf against the Eidege breeze, "that the body can suffer terribly from things one thinks are entirely in the mind." Tommy, unsure what to make of this, nodded politely and said he had to be getting on. Miss Marple smiled and continued on toward the greengrocer. She had learned 2 things from that conversation. 1. The authorities were still confused by the death. 2. Nobody had asked yet why Margaret Calthorpe had come to St. Mary Mead in the first place. At that very moment, Inspector Cray was seated across from Reverend Clemency, notebook open. "Did the deceased have any prior contact with you?" Cray asked, pen poised. The vicar shook his head. "None. I didn't know she was coming. But my wife believes she asked after the vicarage upon arrival." "Did you know her name before yesterday?" The Reverend hesitated. "I did not. Though I confess the name does feel familiar. I cannot say why." Cray narrowed his eyes. "Do you keep a guest book for visitors to the church?" "We do. Though only those who attend Sunday services tend to sign it." Cray made a note. "Would she have had any reason to come to you? Spiritually, I mean. She may have. It's possible. But if she was seeking absolution, I fear she didn't reach the right door in time." Cray let that hang, then asked, "Did she have any enemies that you know of in the parish?" The Reverend looked genuinely startled. "Inspector, she was a stranger." Cray merely nodded and moved on to the next name. Elsewhere, Miss Marple was visiting Mrs. Bantry, her dear friend, and one of the few women in the village who knew exactly how to host an impromptu gossip session without ever appearing nosy. They sat in the drawing-room of Gossington Hall, the fireplace lit, a plate of almond biscuits on the sideboard. "You do realise," Mrs. Bantry said, nibbling one delicately, "that half the village thinks she was running from a man." "That's very likely," Miss Marple said, "but far more important is which man, and why she chose to run here." Mrs. Bantry tilted her head. "And you think she knew someone in St. Mary Mead?" "Oh, she certainly did. One doesn't board the last train to a village like ours without a destination in mind, or someone waiting. But no one was waiting." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, and sipped her tea. Mrs. Bantry blinked. "I don't follow." She believed someone would be waiting, and they were not. That evening, after dinner, Miss Marple took a walk past the station. The platform was quiet, the ticket booth shuttered. The porter, an older man named Mr. de Lally, was adjusting the chalk sign that gave the arrival times for the morning trains. Miss Marple approached him gently. "You were working the evening Miss Calthorpe arrived?" He looked up, brushing chalk from his fingers. "I thought it odd I did. That one, she didn't have luggage, just a little handbag. And she didn't go to the taxis. Asked me if the vicarage was still where it used to be. And then started walking up the lane, but then she stopped." "Stopped?" Mr. Lally nodded. "Right by the old phone box. Looked like she'd seen something or someone. Did you see what it was?" He shook his head. "Too dark. But she froze for a second, then she walked off, fast." Miss Marple was quiet a moment. "And where does the phone box face?" "Back road, leads toward the church, and the Bayleaf guest house." Miss Marple thanked him. As she walked home, her mind sifted through the layers of the woman's brief time in the village. A question lingered like the frost in the air. What had she seen in that moment? What, or who, had changed everything? That night, in her quiet parlour, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap. Though her fingers never moved, Margaret Calthorpe had come to St. Mary Mead expecting something. Refuge, perhaps, or confrontation. She had come alone, quietly, and she had died in silence, not from injury, not from poison, but from something far subtler. Fear and fear, Miss Marple knew, always had a source. Chapter 4. The First Suspect. By the end of the week, Inspector Cray had formed what he believed to be a workable theory, which he shared grudgingly with Sergeant Wood and, less formally, with Colonel Easterbrook, who had invited him to tea under the pretence of public cooperation. "It's always the same," Cray muttered, holding a sturdy mug of Earl Grey with both hands. "Everyone says they didn't know her, yet the dead woman ends up here in their lap. This Margaret Calthorpe didn't just stumble off a train by accident. She came with a purpose, and I think I know who she came to see." Colonel Easterbrook leaned forward with all the tact of a man who had once commanded battalions. "Well, go on, man. You can't dangle it like that." Cray set the mug down with a thud. Benedict Welbury. The name hung in the air like a forgotten tune. The Welbury name was not unfamiliar in St. Mary Mead. Benedict Welbury, once the charming but irresponsible younger son of Sir Anthony Welbury of Welbury Chase, had made quiet scandal in his youth. There had been gambling, debts, and a brief engagement to a London woman. broken abruptly under mysterious circumstances. After that, he'd seemingly vanished from society circles, only to resurface 5 years ago in the village as the modest and mild-mannered Mr. Ben Wilkinson, piano tutor and tenant of the parsonage cottage. It had not gone unnoticed at the time, though few had made much of it. People came to St. Mary Mead to vanish all the time. As long as they paid their rent and mowed their lawns, no one asked questions. Except, of course, Miss Marple. The news of Benedict Welbury's possible involvement spread quickly, though officially nothing had been confirmed. The Bayleaf Guest House reported a sudden drop in inquiries. Mrs. Biddle accidentally left at the door to the post office open to catch fragments of passing gossip, and the Finchley twins could be seen loitering near the cottage lane, pretending to collect flowers for church arrangements. Meanwhile, Ben Wilkinson himself kept to his routine, almost conspicuously so. He continued to tutor the vicar's niece in piano 3 times a week. He fetched milk from the dairy. He nodded to passers-by with a quiet, awkward smile, but if his steps had always been soft, they now seemed calculated. Miss Marple observed all this from a distance, rarely speaking of it, but quietly collecting threads. On Saturday morning, she paid a perfectly ordinary visit to Mrs. Haydock, the village doctor's wife, under the pretence of borrowing a book on rhododendrons. Mrs. Haydock, a brisk woman with a passion for truth and tennis, did not disappoint. "Ben Wilkinson," she said, handing Miss Marple a biscuit along with the book. "Oh, I wouldn't be surprised at all. There's something too neat about that man. Too quiet, and I'm not one to speak ill, but the way he avoids looking people in the eye, it's not natural. Some people," Miss Marple murmured, "avoid eye contact because they've been taught to hide. Others because they've seen too much." Haydock blinked. "Well, whichever it is, the man's up to something. My husband says he hasn't come in for a check-up in 3 years, and that's not normal for a man his age, especially with that cough of his." Miss Marple smiled politely and took her leave soon after. She wasn't one for rushing judgment, especially when judgment was so keen to rush itself. At the village hall, Inspector Cray met with Ben Wilkinson in private. The interview, by most accounts, was civil. Cray asked about his past. Ben admitted, after brief resistance, that he had once been known as Benedict Welbury, that he had changed his name to avoid the embarrassment of his broken engagement and debts, that he had rebuilt his life quietly and legally with no further incident. "I had no reason to see Margaret Calthorpe again," he said, voice low. "Our parting was painful, yes, but mutual. She understood. I was not a good man back then. And yet," Cray said, eyes narrowing, "she took a train from London to this village, arrived in the dark, asked for the vicarage, and was found dead not an hour later." Ben said nothing. Cray leaned back. "You didn't go to the station?" "No." "You didn't meet her on the path?" "No." "And you didn't kill her?" "No," Ben said, his voice nearly a whisper. But Miss Marple, watching from across the green as the door to the village hall opened and Ben emerged with slumped shoulders, knew one thing for certain. That was not the face of a murderer. It was the face of a man who had expected to be accused. Later that evening, Miss Marple invited Dolly Bantry for tea. "I've always found," Miss Marple said as she poured a fragrant Darjeeling, "that in villages People are happiest when a suspect is found, especially if it's someone they already suspected. But you don't think he did it, Dolly said. I think he's hiding something. But so is everyone, really. The question is whether what he's hiding is relevant. Miss Marple paused, then added, Margaret Calther. P arrived with no suitcase, only a handbag, and she wore gloves. Rather fine ones, too, cashmere-lined. Not something one wears if one expects to flee in disgrace or desperation. Dolly frowned. You think she came with confidence. I think she came with intention. She came to confront someone. And it wasn't Ben? Miss Marple didn't answer at first. Then she said, Tell me, Dolly, have you ever known someone to travel into the lion's den to reconcile with the lion? No, Dolly said slowly, only to put it down. Miss Marple nodded once. Exactly. At dusk, Miss Marple stood by her window again, watching as the 6:10 train from Paddington steamed into view, its lights glowing like fireflies in the growing dark. She watched the passengers alight, fewer now than in summer, mostly commuters and the odd visitor. But one figure made her blink. A woman in a plum-coloured coat, elegant, mid-40s, not quite local. She watched as the woman stepped onto the platform, paused, then turned. Toward the church path, Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose. Because, in her experience, people rarely arrived in St. Mary Mead by accident, and they never came alone. Chapter 5. The Missing Glove. The next morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a light mist and the faintest scent of dew-drenched lilac. It was the sort of morning that tempted one into believing all was peaceful in the world, unless, of course, one lived in a village where a woman had died mysteriously 3 evenings prior. In Mrs. Biddle's post office, the talk had already shifted from Benedict Welbury's past to the arrival of another stranger, or as she described the woman in the plum-coloured coat who had stepped off the train the previous night. "Something's afoot, I can tell," she said to Mr. Sims, who had come in for a copy of the Telegraph. That one had London written all over her, good tailoring, and a mouth set like she'd swallowed her own secrets. Mr. Sims made an appreciative grunt. "Not local," he agreed, "which makes 2 in 1 week. Never a good sign." "Not since the missing clergyman in 48, she said darkly. What neither of them realized, nor for that matter did Inspector Cray, was that the woman in question had not come by chance. Miss Marple knew this. She had seen her arrive, and she had noted the hesitation on the platform, the way the woman had stepped off with confidence, but paused before taking the path toward the church. And it was not Ben Wilkinson's cottage she passed by. It was Dr. Castle's surgery. That very afternoon, Miss Marple made a visit to the doctor's wife, under the pretence of returning a tin of lemon biscuits. "You're just in time for coffee," said Agnes Castle, who was always 2 steps ahead of hospitality and 2 degrees behind actual warmth. They settled in the sunroom, where the roses on the wallpaper had begun to fade, but the armchairs were still perfectly plumped. "Busy week," Agnes said meaningfully. "Roger's barely been home." "I imagine the police are quite thorough," Miss Marple offered mildly. "Have they ruled out natural causes?" Agnes sighed. "You know Roger can't say much, but between you and me, there was nothing wrong. With her, not a single thing. Heart was strong, lungs clear. He said it's like she just stopped. As though her body gave out, not from illness, but from something else. Shock, perhaps? Miss Marple asked. Possibly, but she wasn't panicked. No signs of flight or collapse, just sudden death. Miss Marple stirred her coffee. Do you happen to know who that woman was who arrived last night? Agnes blinked. You saw her, too? Miss Marple nodded. She walked straight past the surgery, looked up at the window, and then walked on. Agnes hesitated. Well, now that you mention it, she came this morning, asked to speak to Roger. He was out, so she left a card. Didn't give a name. I was going to tell him when he gets back. I see, Miss Marple said, as though the information weren't the most significant she'd heard all day. And it was, because this stranger, whoever she was, had known where to find Dr. Castle. And Margaret Calthorpe, according to the village, had not. Miss Marple left the house with a slow, measured step. She did not turn back to glance at the surgery window, but she did note the hedge, carefully trimmed, and the path worn slightly near the gate. That evening, she opened a drawer in her sitting room, removed the Radio Times cutting with Margaret, Calthorpe's engagement notice, and placed it beside a postcard she had received from her late cousin Clara, once married to a solicitor in Kensington. The handwriting was flowing, elegant, slightly old-fashioned, and so too was the writing on the back of the train ticket found in Margaret's pocket. Inspector Cray had dismissed it as a woman's note to herself, a scribble reading, "Ask at vicarage or surgery discreetly." Miss Marple had thought no more of it, until now. The next morning, Miss Marple made a brief stop at the vicarage. Reverend Clemency welcomed her in his usual gentle manner, though his eyes were shadowed by strain. "I must confess," he said, offering a digestive biscuit, "I feel dreadfully useless in all this. If she came to seek help, she didn't find it. You couldn't have known," Miss Marple said kindly. "But I wonder, do you keep old registers? Guest books, perhaps? Records of inquiries made?" The vicar looked slightly puzzled. "I do, yes, though I can't see how that— Would you mind if I had a quick look?" He fetched a small green volume with neatly dated entries. Miss Marple flipped through them with practised fingers. There, on a page dated 3 months prior, she saw it. Margaret C., requesting contact for Dr. R. Castle. Said urgent but not medical. Left no address. Promised return. She tapped the page once and closed the book with a small nod. "Thank you, Reverend. This has been most helpful." And it had, because Margaret Calthorpe had been in contact with someone in the village, and she had not come unannounced. She had come with purpose. But someone hadn't wanted her visit recorded. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the police station. She brought with her a parcel of freshly baked currant scones. Officially, for the sergeant, though it was known they had a way of finding their way into Inspector Cray's office. As she handed over the parcel, she asked gently, "I believe the deceased was wearing gloves?" Cray, preoccupied with a pile of unhelpful reports, waved a hand. "Yes, fine gloves, 1 pair, cashmere-lined, found in her coat pocket, pale grey." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Both gloves?" Cray looked up. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said lightly, "women are terrible about misplacing gloves. I only ask because I noticed on the platform the night she arrived, her left hand was bare. The right held her bag. I remember the ring she wore. Opal and pearls, very unusual. Cray blinked. "I'll check the inventory," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "You do that." By dusk, a message had come from the forensic clerk. Only one glove had been retrieved from the body, and it had been the right-hand glove. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched again. A woman boards a train late at night, holding a handbag in one gloved hand and a bare hand that shows a distinctive ring. By the time her body is found, the ring is gone, and the other glove is in her coat pocket. Someone had met her, someone had taken something, and someone had planted the glove. But they had done it too neatly, and neatness, as Miss Marple well knew, was the greatest clue of all, because real crimes are rarely tidy. Chapter 6. Beneath the surface by Monday, St. Mary Mead had begun to take on a slightly breathless air, as though the village itself were holding something in. The shops opened as usual, the post was delivered on time, and even the vicar's sermon, on the previous Sunday, on the subject of truth and its inconvenient timing, had been delivered without scandal. But beneath the surface, conversation was strained, and glances seemed a shade too careful. The London papers had begun sniffing around, sending a reporter in a rumpled coat to ask ill-phrased questions outside the station. He was quickly rebuffed by Mrs. Biddle, who considered herself the only authority on stories worth printing. The village didn't like murder. It especially didn't like lingering murder, unsolved, uncontained. And Margaret Calthorpe, though dead, had proven surprisingly difficult to bury. Inspector Cray, for his part, remained focused on Ben Wilkinson. Despite Miss Marple's careful hint about the missing glove, Cray had yet to veer from his chosen suspect. His constable, Tommy Pike, had dutifully searched the area near the church path again for signs of a discarded glove, ring, or any other item. But nothing turned up. To Cray, that only reinforced his belief. "She must have removed the ring herself," he told Sergeant Wood. "Got cold feet. Decided to call off whatever she came to do. Died of shock before she could say a word." "Rather convenient, isn't it?" Wood replied. Cray didn't answer. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had decided to take a walk. It was a clear afternoon, and she had arranged to call upon Dr. Castle, not for any ailment, but for a discussion of joint stiffness, which she claimed had worsened since the death of her cousin's cat. Dr. Castle, ever polite, ushered her into the consulting room, where he took her pulse and asked, as he always did, whether she was keeping up her water intake. "I drink what's necessary," Miss Marple said with a smile. "But you know, I always find that the body reacts most strongly when the mind is under strain. You must see a great deal of that." Castle adjusted his spectacles. "I wouldn't say a great deal, no, not even from someone like Mr. Wilkinson." Doctor blinked. "He's not a patient of mine." "Ah," Miss Marple said, gently dabbing at her mouth with a handkerchief. "Forgive me. I assumed, well, he lives so near." And with that persistent cough of his, Castle cleared his throat. "People tend to avoid doctors until they absolutely must see them." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet I always think it says a great deal about a person, whom they choose to trust in a crisis." She stood. "You've been very kind, Doctor, but I won't take up more of your time." As she left the surgery, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest frown, because Dr. Castle had been nervous, not overtly, but the way his hand had hovered too long on his pen, the way his smile faltered at the mention of Ben Wilkinson. Something was being held back, and in her long experience, doctors didn't hold things back for just anyone. They did it for family, or for old friends, or for debt. That evening, Miss Marple returned home to find a small envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a note, unsigned. She didn't come here to confront Ben. She came because of what she knew about someone else, someone who was supposed to protect her, someone who failed her once already. Miss Marple read it twice. There was no handwriting to match, not that she could recall, but the tone was bitter, sharp and female. She filed it away in a drawer marked pending, beside old ration books and receipts from garden club luncheons. The next day, Miss Marple paid a call to Mrs. Harcourt, the landlady of the Bayleaf Guest House. Mrs. Harcourt was a careful woman, obsessed with linen folding, and convinced that her reputation as a hostess had not suffered since the incident. "Oh, you're quite right to ask," she said when Miss Marple inquired about her guest register. "She never arrived, you know. The room was waiting, perfectly made up, biscuits untouched. Had you spoken to her before she booked the room?" "Oh, no, dear. She'd written a letter, quite short. Said she was coming from London, just for the night. Didn't say why, but that's not uncommon." Miss Marple smiled. "May I see the letter?" Mrs. Harcourt looked hesitant. "I gave it to the police." "Of course you did. And did the handwriting seem familiar?" Mrs. Harcourt considered this. Not particularly. Elegant, confident, someone used to making arrangements. Not someone in distress. "Oh, no," she said quickly. "Quite the opposite." Miss Marple nodded. It matched the note in her drawer. Back at home, she placed the unsigned message beside the known samples of Margaret Calthorpe's writing and studied them under her reading lamp. They did not match, which meant the note hadn't come from Margaret. It had come from someone else, someone who wanted the police to look away from Ben Wilkinson and focus elsewhere. The question was, why? That evening, a quiet confrontation occurred that few in the village noticed. Miss Marple was returning from the church path just after sundown, when she found herself face to face with Dr. Castle, standing beside his garden gate with an unlit pipe in hand. They exchanged polite greetings, but before Miss Marple could pass, he said, "You're looking for something, Miss Marple, and I'd rather you didn't find it." She paused. He did not look angry, only tired. "I'm afraid," she said gently, "that the truth is rarely something one seeks. It tends to arrive all on its own." Castle gave a small, sad smile. "She wasn't meant to die. She came here for help, and I failed her." Miss Marple stepped closer. "You knew her then?" He nodded once. "We were engaged, briefly, before Benedict, before the whole affair with the Welberys." Miss Marple drew a breath, almost imperceptibly. "And she still trusted you?" "I suppose she did." "Then why?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Did she die alone?" Dr. Castle didn't answer. He stepped back into his garden and closed the gate behind him. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting once again untouched. So far, the village had told the story one way. Margaret Calthorpe arrived too, confront Benedict Welbury. But now Miss Marple saw another possibility. Margaret had come not to accuse, but to reveal, and someone else, someone not yet suspected, had every reason to make sure she never did. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The following morning dawned damp and dim, with fog clinging low along the hedgerows like smoke from a dying fire. St. Mary Mead moved quietly. Shops opened later than usual. Footsteps were softer, and even the church bell rang with an unusually restrained chime. And yet, for all its hush, something was stirring beneath the surface. Miss Marple had dressed early. Her hat was modest and blue, her gloves soft and neatly buttoned, and her mind, though few would guess it, was sharp and utterly focused. She had made 2 decisions over her breakfast tea. 1. The killer was still in the village. 2. They did not yet know she had seen them. She began her day with a visit to Ben Wilkinson. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. Wilkinson," she said pleasantly, as he opened the door. "But I wondered if you'd do me a kindness." "Of course," he said. "Anything. I've a small matter with the church. The vicar's away, and I've been asked to help prepare for the concert next week. I thought you might give the piano a quick look. It hasn't been tuned since the Harvest Festival." Ben smiled, and something in his shoulders eased. The request was so ordinary, so normal. "Certainly," he said. "I'll walk there with you." "Splendid." As they walked, Miss Marple made idle talk. Weather, foxglove patterns, and the peculiar habit of jackdaws stealing washing pegs. But just as they reached the path past the surgery, she stopped. "Oh, do forgive me," she said, patting her coat. "I've dropped my glove. Would you mind terribly going back to look? Just there by the orchard, I think." Ben nodded. Obliging, she watched him go, his back turned. He walked slowly. No panic, no glance over his shoulder. Miss Marple allowed herself a tiny nod. He was not the one watching for traps. At the church, she found the old upright piano waiting, slightly askew on the dais. She pretended to fiddle with flower arrangements while Ben tuned quietly. The notes drifted upward, smooth and melancholy. When they finished, Miss Marple thanked him with a gentle smile and said, "You know, Margaret Calthorpe loved music. I remember reading about it in the Tatler. They said she used to play the waltz in D minor by heart." Ben froze. He looked at Miss Marple. "She did," he said. "She taught it to me." "Did you know she had a return ticket?" Miss Marple asked casually. "One she never used." Ben hesitated. "She was going to come and leave quietly, wasn't she?" "I think so. Yes." "But someone made sure she didn't," Miss Marple said, and turned to rearrange a lily that didn't need rearranging. Ben didn't reply, didn't expect him to. Next, she visited the Bayleaf guest house, asking politely after Mrs. Harcourt and inquiring whether the post had arrived. It hadn't, but the landlady invited her in anyway, pleased to have company and a reason to serve stale Madeira cake. Miss Marple let the conversation drift toward travel. "Did you ever think of leaving the village, Mrs. Harcourt, after your husband passed?" "Goodness, no. Why would I? All I've ever needed is here. And everyone who knows you," Miss Marple added. The woman gave a modest smile. "Exactly." Miss Marple took a bite of cake, chewed thoughtfully, and asked, "And would you say the same of Dr. Castle?" Mrs. Harcourt blinked. "Roger? Well, no, I suppose not. He always had one foot out, didn't he? Still took calls from London. Still kept those city clothes. But he stayed. He always stayed. Miss Marple set down her fork, and now he's gone. By mid-afternoon, she was back at home. A fire crackled in the grate. Her cat, Minerva, curled at her feet. On the table beside her, arranged with the precision of a mind long trained to catalogue the unseen, sat the return train ticket, unused, a single left-hand glove, the anonymous note-a-page torn from the Tatler, years old, and a photograph, sent to her that morning by post from a cousin in Leeds. The photograph showed Roger Castle in his student years, standing beside a younger Margaret Calthorpe. But what Miss Marple noticed was the woman on the edge of the frame, Agnes Castle, unsmiling, watching, not yet married to him, not yet his wife. Just before sunset, Miss Marple wrote 2 short notes. One to Inspector Cray, asking him to gather the relevant parties at the Vicarage Hall that evening for a quiet word. The second she sent directly to Agnes Castle, inviting her for tea. At 6:30, the 2 women sat in Miss Marple's parlour. Agnes accepted tea, but not the biscuit. "I imagine this is about Roger," she said. "In part," Miss Marple said, "though I've always believed the truth is less about the person missing, and more about the person who knew they would be missed." Agnes sipped her tea. "Why did Margaret come here, Agnes?" "She came to destroy us," Agnes said quietly, but without hesitation. "After all these years, she was going to expose him and me. She had nothing left to lose. She said so herself. And so," Miss Marple said gently, "you met her, that night, by the orchard. You said nothing. You waited until she turned her back, and then you made sure she would never speak." Agnes looked up, her eyes glassy but dry. "I didn't mean to kill her. I only wanted her to be frightened, just for a moment, to remember what it felt like to lose everything." Miss Marple did not flinch. She already had. Later that evening, Inspector Cray made the formal arrest. Agnes Castle surrendered quietly. She did not ask for her husband. She only asked whether anyone would tend to the roses in the back garden. As the fog rolled in again, and the trains passed unnoticed in the dark, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. A simple cable pattern, comforting, repetitive. She looked out at the quiet street and murmured to herself, "People always think murder comes from hatred, but sometimes it comes from something far simpler. The fear of being forgotten." And with that, she bent to her work, because the mystery was solved, but the village, as always, would go on. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room. Truth. The Vicarage Hall, modestly adorned with brass sconces and a faint smell of lavender polish, was unseasonably warm that evening. A fire had been lit against the lingering chill, and the chairs, arranged in a neat semicircle around a small side table, gave the distinct impression of a gathering more social than official. Yet the expressions of those assembled were anything but casual. Inspector Cray stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, jaw set. He had agreed reluctantly to Miss Marple's request to bring the relevant parties together before making any final statement to the press. Cray didn't care for dramatics, but he did care for clarity, and Miss Marple for all her fussy shawls and knitted tea-cosies had a reputation for delivering exactly that. Seated in the room were Ben Wilkinson, face pale but calm as Harcourt, twisting her wedding ring absent-mindedly Dolly Bantry, silent, eyes flicking between faces, Reverend Clemency, hands folded in his lap. And finally, Dr. Roger Castle, who had returned that morning after 3 days missing, dishevelled, gaunt, and looking every inch the man who had run from a truth too long buried. Miss Marple stood near the small table, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "I thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle, her tone perfectly calm, "and I do hope you will forgive me for the theatrics of this gathering. I find that when a matter is delicate, it is best to speak plainly before the facts grow any more tangled." She glanced around the room. "You all know, of course, that Margaret Calthorpe died here in St. Mary Mead after arriving on the 6:10 from London. Her death, though lacking visible injury, was far from natural. It was, in fact, the result of a carefully administered psychological blow, the kind that stops the heart, not through violence, but through something far more precise." Cray made a slight sound, half agreement, half scepticism, but remained silent. Miss Marple continued. At first, the suspicion fell on Mr. Wilkinson. Unfairly, I might add. His past, though complicated, did not link him to Margaret's final hours in the way we were led to believe. Ben stiffened but said nothing. "No," Miss Marple said. "The truth, as it often does, lay in the margins, in what we overlooked. A single glove, misplaced. A return ticket, unused. A note left unsigned." She turned to Dr. Castle. "Dr. Castle, you knew Margaret before your marriage. You were, in fact, her first fiancé." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Roger Castle looked down. "Yes," he said. "She came here to see you," Miss Marple said. "But not to threaten you, not to accuse you, to warn you." He blinked, confused. "Warn me?" Miss Marple nodded. She had learned something she believed involved danger. Not to herself, but to someone she once cared for. You, and more specifically, your wife. Roger looked up sharply. She never meant to expose anything. Not if it would destroy you, but someone else. Believed she might. Miss Marple turned slowly. To Agnes Castle. The room fell into stunned silence. "She confronted Margaret at the orchard," Miss Marple said. "She met her under cover of darkness. Margaret must have spoken her intent to tell the truth, to finally lift the burden she'd carried for both your sakes. And Agnes, believing this would ruin her life, struck, not with fists but with fear. Enough to shock the heart, enough to kill. She told me," Roger began, then stopped. "She told you she never saw Margaret," Miss Marple finished, "just as she told you she supported you all these years. But the truth is, Agnes has lived in fear of Margaret for longer than you've known. She saw the photo. She recognized her. She knew the woman you once loved might return and take it all away." There was a long pause, then Cray spoke. "That's quite a theory." Miss Marple turned to him. "It's not theory, Inspector. Agnes confessed it to me. Quietly, in my parlour. Not with malice, but with exhaustion. And I believe she will say as much to you, if you ask with the same gentleness." Cray, to his credit, did not argue. after the others had left. Some in shock, others in silence. Roger Castle remained behind. "She protected me," he said finally, voice low. "Even at the end," Miss Marple nodded. "As women so often do." He looked at her. "What would you have done if you were in Margaret's shoes?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. Then, with the barest sigh, she said, "I'd have taken the return train." The next day, Agnes Castle was taken into quiet custody. There was no trial, not in the way one imagines. A coroner's inquest found the death to be manslaughter, brought on by provoked emotional distress. She was sentenced to confinement at a private hospital, far from St. Mary Mead. Dr. Castle resigned his practice. Ben Wilkinson packed his bags and returned to London, where a new teaching position awaited. The village went on, the post office reopened, with the same lace curtains. Mrs. Biddle returned to managing, her parcels with the same gossipy efficiency. The vicar gave a sermon on truth as a double-edged sword, and the Blue Boar began offering a new drink called the Last Train. Miss Marple, for her part, finished her cable-knit scarf and began a fresh mystery novel. She did not speak often of Margaret Calthorpe, but once, while sitting with Dolly Bantry in the garden, she said, "Some women never get the chance to finish their story. But that doesn't mean they didn't try to. Tell it." Chapter 10. The last stitch spring, when it finally arrived in St. Mary Mead, came not with fanfare, but with quiet conviction. The hedges blushed green again, snowdrops bowed shyly beneath the oaks, and the villagers, without fully realizing it, began to breathe easier. The murder had passed, as all things must in a village like this, into story. It was spoken of less often, and only in lowered tones. The name Margaret Calthorpe became a ghost in conversation, invoked only by those old enough to remember her arrival, and wise enough not to speculate too freely on what could not be undone. The post office Mrs. Biddle began greeting newcomers with slightly less suspicion. The vicar resumed his sermons with greater warmth, though his hands lingered longer than usual over the font, and the Blue Boar, ever enterprising, renamed their midweek supper special Margaret's Roast, though no one said it aloud without a glance toward the door. Only a few truly remembered, and only one truly understood. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, beneath the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock, her knitting basket at her side, and a teacup warming her hands. Outside, the first swallows flitted over the garden wall, their shadows gliding briefly across the window pane like secrets on the edge of being revealed. Dolly Bantry, seated opposite her, reached for a biscuit. "I suppose you knew all along," she said lightly, "that Agnes was the one." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no, Dolly, not all along. One never does. There are always so many possibilities, so many faces that look quite like guilt, but aren't. But when someone tries too hard to tidy the edges of a tragedy, I always grow suspicious." Dolly looked thoughtful. She never meant to kill her, though, no, Miss Marple agreed. But fear doesn't always wait for intention. Agnes had spent her life building something, order, reputation, love, and when she saw it threatened by a woman who'd once shared it with her husband, she lashed out, not with violence exactly, but with pressure. And Margaret, poor Margaret, already carrying the weight of too much silence, simply broke beneath it. Dolly was quiet a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, It's rather awful, isn't it, that people can carry such things inside them and still smile so sweetly. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window. Yes, she said softly, but it's also rather human. In the weeks that followed, the village moved on in small ways. The vicarage garden, once overgrown, bloomed again under the care of a new groundsman. Ben Wilkinson sent a postcard from London, thanking Miss Marple and announcing his new appointment at a small music school in Islington. The surgery was let to a new doctor, a quiet Welshman with a kind face and a fondness for dahlias. And one morning, with no fanfare, a package arrived at Miss Marple's doorstep. Inside was a box of sheet, music, waltzes wrapped in tissue paper and unsigned. Miss Marple placed it gently on the shelf, between tales from the village choir and gardening for the south-facing border. She did not need a name to know who had sent it. On a soft Thursday evening, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard. The grass was damp underfoot, the air tinged with lilac and honeysuckle. She paused before a small, unmarked gravestone recently placed near the old yew. There were no flowers, only a folded train ticket pressed carefully into the earth. Return, unused. Miss Marple stood for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, "You tried to come home. I hope now you've found your way." She turned and walked back down the path, her steps measured, her back straight, her shadow long and slender across the fading light. Murder in St. Mary Mead never arrives loudly. It comes quietly, in a look, in a silence held too long, in a secret born for too many years. But so too does justice, and justice, Miss Marple always believed, need not be dramatic. It need only be complete. Chapter 10. The last stitch spring, when it finally arrived in St. Mary Mead, came not with fanfare, but with quiet conviction. The hedges blushed green again, snowdrops bowed shyly beneath the oaks, and the villagers, without fully realizing it, began to breathe easier. The murder had passed, as all things must in a village like this, into story. It was spoken of less often, and only in lowered tones. The name Margaret Calthorpe became a ghost in conversation, invoked only by those old enough to remember her arrival, and wise enough not to speculate too freely on what could not be undone. The post office Mrs. Biddle began greeting newcomers with slightly less suspicion. The vicar resumed his sermons with greater warmth, though his hands lingered longer than usual over the font, and the Blue Boar, ever enterprising, renamed their midweek supper special Margaret's Roast, though no one said it aloud without a glance toward the door. Only a few truly remembered, and only one truly understood. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, beneath the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock, her knitting basket at her side, and a teacup warming her hands. Outside, the first swallows flitted over the garden wall, their shadows gliding briefly across the window pane like secrets on the edge of being revealed. Dolly Bantry, seated opposite her, reached for a biscuit. "I suppose you knew all along," she said lightly, "that Agnes was the one." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no, Dolly, not all along. One never does. There are always so many possibilities, so many faces that look quite like guilt, but aren't. But when someone tries too hard to tidy the edges of a tragedy, I always grow suspicious." Dolly looked thoughtful. She never meant to kill her, though no, Miss Marple agreed. But fear doesn't always wait for intention. Agnes had spent her life building something: order, reputation, love, and when she saw it threatened by a woman who'd once shared it with her husband, she lashed out, not with violence exactly, but with pressure. And Margaret, poor Margaret, already carrying the weight of too much silence, simply broke beneath it. Dolly was quiet a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. It's rather awful, isn't it, that people can carry such things inside them and still smile so sweetly? Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window. Yes, she said softly, but it's also rather human. In the weeks that followed, the village moved on in small ways. The vicarage garden, once overgrown, bloomed again under the care of a new groundsman. Ben Wilkinson sent a postcard from London, thanking Miss Marple and announcing his new appointment at a small music school in Islington. The surgery was let to a new doctor, a quiet Welshman with a kind face and a fondness for dahlias. And one morning, with no fanfare, a package arrived at Miss Marple's doorstep. Inside was a box of sheet, music, waltzes wrapped in tissue paper and unsigned. Miss Marple placed it gently on the shelf, between tales from the village choir and gardening for the south-facing border. She did not need a name to know who had sent it. On a soft Thursday evening, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard. The grass was damp underfoot, the air tinged with lilac and honeysuckle. She paused before a small, unmarked gravestone recently placed near the old yew. There were no flowers, only a folded train ticket pressed carefully into the earth. Return, unused. Miss Marple stood for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, "You tried to come home. I hope now you've found your way." She turned and walked back down the path, her steps measured, her back straight, her shadow long and slender across the fading light. Murder in St. Mary Mead never arrives loudly. It comes quietly, in a look, in a silence held too long, in a secret born for too many years. But so too does justice, and justice, Miss Marple always believed, need not be dramatic. It need only be complete.